Have you ever witnessed a miracle that defies all logic? The millionaire teased the black girl, "I'll give you $1 million if you cure me." She touched him, and the impossible happened. What a lovely little play of children playing doctor. Richard Thornton sneered, adjusting his sunglasses as he watched from the seat of his customized Rolls-Royce. "I bet you don't even know what a real stethoscope is." The park was crowded on that sunny Saturday afternoon, and a group of children from the local community were playing hospital using sticks as instruments and leaves as prescriptions. Richard had stopped there only because his driver needed to fix a mechanical problem. But the sight of the children healing each other with such seriousness amused him cruelly. At 53, Richard Thornton was the kind of man who turned personal tragedy into bitterness directed at the world. 5 years earlier, a stroke had confined him to a wheelchair, but that had only intensified his natural arrogance. Heir to a real estate empire worth $400 million, he used his physical condition as an excuse to be even more disrespectful to those he considered inferior. "Hey, you there," he shouted at a girl of about 10 who was standing a little apart from the group, watching silently. She was black, wore a simple dress, and had an intensity in her eyes that was disturbing for someone so young. "Why aren't you playing with your make-believe friends?" The girl, whose name was Zuri, walked slowly toward the park fence. She showed no fear or intimidation, just a calm curiosity that made Richard slightly uncomfortable. "It's not make-believe," she replied in a firm voice. "It's faith." Richard laughed loudly, drawing the attention of other park visitors. "Faith, girl, I have an irresistible offer for you. Check this out," he gestured dramatically to his immobile legs. "I've been paralyzed for 5 years. The best doctors in the country have given up on me. If you really believe in this faith-healing nonsense, I'll give you $1 million if you can make me walk again." Several people began to gather around, some discreetly taking pictures with their cell phones. Richard loved being the center of attention, especially when he could humiliate someone publicly. $1 million, he repeated, pulling out his wallet and waving several hundred bills. "Cash right here in front of everyone. What do you say, little healer?" Zuri studied his face for a long moment as if reading something invisible in his expression. Then, to everyone's surprise, she smiled, not a childish or intimidated smile, but something deep and knowing. "Get the money," she said simply. The crowd murmured, some laughing nervously. Could this be the moment a miracle unfolds before your eyes? Richard felt a strange twinge of unease, but he pushed it away quickly. "All right, then," he said, clapping his hands. "Let's get this show on. Let everyone see how this faith of yours works." Zuri approached the wheelchair unhurriedly. She placed a small hand on his right knee and closed her eyes. For a few seconds, nothing happened except the tense silence of the watching crowd. Then Richard felt something he hadn't felt in 5 long years, a subtle, almost imperceptible tingling running down his leg. His eyes widened, but before he could fully process what was happening, Zuri opened her eyes and stepped away. "Is that it?" Richard asked, forcing a laugh. "That was your big miracle." But as he spoke, the tingling intensified, and for the first time since the accident, Richard Thornton felt his toes move inside his $3,000 Italian shoes. The mocking expression on his face slowly began to fade, replaced by something between panic and utter disbelief. Because if this girl had truly done the impossible, it meant that his entire worldview was about to come crashing down. And from the determined look in Zuri's eyes, that was exactly what she intended. If you're captivated by this tale, stay tuned, things are about to take an unexpected turn on Black Voices. 3 hours later, Richard Thornton was locked in his penthouse, pacing back and forth across the room with hesitant, awkward steps. His legs trembled like those of a newborn learning to walk, but they worked. For the first time in 5 years, he was standing. "This is impossible," he muttered to himself, holding on to the furniture to keep his balance. Placebo effect. Adrenaline. Some delayed neurological reaction to the medication. He had dismissed his driver and returned home in absolute silence, refusing to process what had really happened in the park. But now, alone with his miraculously functioning legs, he could no longer deny reality. The intercom rang. "Mr. Thornton, this is Dr. Harrison. You asked me to come urgently." Dr. Michael Harrison had been Richard's private neurologist for 3 years, one of the country's leading experts on spinal cord injuries. When he arrived at the apartment and saw his patient walking toward the door, he almost dropped his medical bag. "Richard, this is extraordinary. How on earth a child touched me," Richard said dryly as if reporting the weather. "A black girl in the park. She put her hand on my leg, and now I can walk." "Explain that with your science." Dr. Harrison performed every test possible: reflexes, sensitivity, muscle strength, MRI. Everything pointed to a neurologically impossible recovery for the type of injury Richard had suffered. "In 40 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like it," the doctor admitted, putting away his equipment. "Your spinal cord was severely damaged. This just doesn't happen." After the doctor left, Richard stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at his reflection for several minutes. It wasn't gratitude he felt. It was deep disturbance. His worldview, built on relentless logic and intellectual superiority, had been shattered by a 10-year-old child. "Who is this girl?" he asked the empty room. The next morning, Richard returned to the park, this time walking on his own 2 feet. He wore sunglasses and a cap, trying to blend in. He watched from a distance until he saw Zuri arrive, walking alone along the path that led to the playground. She was wearing the same simple dress as the day before, worn sneakers, and carrying a patched school backpack. She sat down on the same bench where she had watched him, taking a worn book out of her backpack, Astronomy for Beginners. Richard approached her slowly. "So, you really did it, didn't you?" Zuri looked up from her book, showing no surprise. "Did you come to pay me back?" "I came for answers." He sat down next to her on the bench, something he would never have done before: sit next to a poor child in a public park. "How did you do that?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try to surprise me." Zuri closed the book and looked him straight in the eye. "Some people carry light, others carry darkness. You carry both, which is why you were able to do it." Richard laughed bitterly. "Light and darkness. What kind of esoteric talk is that?" "I'm a businessman, girl. I deal in hard facts." "All right," she said, opening the book again. "Then consider a hard fact. You can walk. Does that change the way you treat people?" The question hit him like a punch. "Why would I change?" "Exactly," she replied simply. And something in the way she said it made Richard feel exposed and uncomfortable. He spent the next few days obsessively investigating everything about Zuri. He hired a private investigator who uncovered some disturbing information. Zuri Washington, 10 years old, lived with her grandmother in a rundown housing project in the suburbs. Her father had died in a work accident 2 years earlier, and her mother worked 3 jobs to support the family. But what shocked Richard most was discovering the address: Riverside Gardens Housing Project, a name he knew all too well. 5 years earlier, the Thornton Development Corporation had bought the land where a neighborhood of simple but dignified houses inhabited mostly by working-class black families had stood. The project was one of the company's most lucrative urban revitalization projects, evicting low-income residents and building luxury condominiums. Zuri's family had been among those displaced. "Mr. Thornton," his private investigator said over the phone, "there's something else you should know. The girl lost her father in an accident at one of your residential buildings. James Washington, an electrician, died when a beam collapsed at the Thornton Towers construction site." Richard hung up the phone and stood in the middle of his office, processing the information. The girl who had healed him was the daughter of a man who died building one of his developments. A family he had evicted to increase his profits, and she knew it. From the look in her eyes that day in the park, she knew exactly who he was. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced around his apartment, something that still surprised him, trying to understand why Zuri had helped him. Why would a child who had every reason to hate him choose to heal him? The answer came in the form of a disturbing memory. When she touched his leg in the park, for a brief moment, he had felt something beyond the physical tingle. He had felt her pain, the pain of losing her father, of seeing her family evicted, of growing up in a world that saw her as invisible. And even carrying that pain, she had chosen to heal rather than hurt. For the first time in years, Richard Thornton found himself staring into a moral mirror that reflected not the successful man he thought he was, but the cruel emptiness he had become. And the irony was devastating. The only person who had ever shown him true compassion was the one he had hurt the most. But what that extraordinary girl didn't know was that Richard Thornton had never learned how to deal with emotional debts. And a debt of this magnitude would require a kind of payment that would change both of their lives forever. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard Thornton became a man obsessed not with the wealth or power that had always defined him, but with an overwhelming need to fully understand the damage he had done to the Washington family. He discreetly hired a team of investigators, not to spy on Zuri this time, but to map out every consequence of his business decisions over the past 10 years. The reports came in daily, each more devastating than the last. "Mr. Thornton," said Margaret Chun, the social investigator he had hired, entering his office with a thick folder. "We've completed the survey of families displaced by the Riverside Gardens project. There are 342 families, 1,087 people directly affected." Richard leafed through the documents, seeing for the first time real faces where before there had only been numbers on spreadsheets. Children forced to change schools, elderly people losing the homes they had lived in for decades, small family businesses destroyed overnight. "And what about Mr. James Washington's accident at work?" Margaret hesitated. It was more serious than the official reports indicated. There were 4 documented safety violations at the construction site that week. The subcontractor responsible for the work had been chosen because it was 40% cheaper than its competitors, even with a questionable accident record. "Go on." "James Washington had reported structural problems 3 days before the accident. The report was filed away without investigation. He died trying to fix a problem that could have been prevented if someone had listened to his concerns." Richard closed his eyes. "Where is that report now?" "Filed in the construction company's systems." "But sir, there's something else you need to know. After Mr. Washington's death, his wife tried to sue the company. The lawyer she managed to hire was persuaded to drop the case." "Persuaded how?" Margaret slid a recording across the table. "Your legal department offered the lawyer a lucrative contract with Thornton Corporation, conditional on his dropping the Washington case. He accepted." The voice on the recording was unmistakably that of David Harrison, his general counsel for 15 years. Richard listened with growing horror as the man he trusted coldly negotiated to ensure that a widow and her daughter would never receive justice. "I need a copy of all these documents," Richard said, his voice steady. "And I want to talk to Mrs. Washington." "Sir, she works 3 jobs now. Cleaning at the city hospital in the early morning, cooking in a restaurant during the day, and caring for the elderly at night. It's hard to find a time when she's available." Richard stood up, walking over to the window of his 40th floor office. Below, the city stretched out like a chessboard, where he had always considered himself king. Now he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. A game where his victories had cost hundreds of families their dignity and their future. "Margaret, I need you to set up a meeting. Not at the office, not anywhere formal, somewhere she'll feel comfortable. And when I say need, I don't mean a business request. I mean a human need." 3 days later, Richard found himself sitting in a modest diner in the neighborhood where Zuri now lived. He had chosen simple clothes, jeans, a cotton shirt, sneakers, trying to look less intimidating. Even so, he felt completely out of place. When Kesha Washington walked in, Richard recognized her immediately. She had the same intense eyes as her daughter, but her features bore the weight of someone who had lost far more than she should have. At 32, she looked 40. Chronic exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "You're the man, my daughter," she began, sitting down hesitantly in the chair opposite him. "Healed?" "Yes." Richard held out his hand, which she shook briefly. "Mrs. Washington, I know this may sound strange, but I needed to talk to you about your husband." Kesha's face hardened immediately. "James has been dead for 2 years. There's nothing to discuss." "Yes, there is. Because I am responsible for his death." The silence in the diner seemed to thicken. Kesha studied his face for long seconds, searching for signs of cruelty or manipulation. She found only raw, painful honesty. My company cut security costs at the construction site where he worked. My lawyers bought the silence of his legal representative. My finance department calculated that it was cheaper to pay fines than to invest in proper equipment. Each word came out like ground glass. I killed your husband out of greed and then I stole your chance at justice. Kesha didn't cry. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. Why are you telling me this now? Because your daughter showed me something I had completely forgotten. That there is still goodness in the world. And I can't carry that goodness on my back while I also carry the weight of the injustice I caused your family. Richard took an envelope from his pocket. These are copies of all the documents related to Jane's accident. Ignored safety reports, internal communications about cost-cutting, recordings of conversations from the legal department, everything. Kesha opened the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes quickly scanning the papers. This proves criminal negligence. Yes, and there's more. Richard slid a business card across the table. This is the number for Samantha Torres, the best labor lawyer in the state. She doesn't work for me. She works against people like me. She's reviewed the entire case and says you're not only entitled to substantial damages, but that the evidence is sufficient for criminal charges. Why? Kesha asked, her voice breaking for the first time. Why are you doing this? Richard thought of Zuri. The way she had touched him in the park, the serenity in her eyes when she said, "Get the money." He thought of the miracle she had performed, not just healing his legs, but showing him the way back to the humanity he had lost. Because your daughter taught me that some miracles come disguised as second chances. And I'm not going to waste mine. When Kesha left the diner an hour later, she carried not only the documents that could change her financial life forever, but something more valuable, confirmation that her husband had been a man of integrity who died trying to protect other workers, and that his death would not be in vain. Richard remained seated, watching her walk away through the window. He knew that conversation was just the beginning. He had a list of 342 families to confront, 15 years of cruel decisions to undo, and an empire built on the suffering of others to rebuild. But for the first time since he regained the use of his legs, he felt truly alive because he was discovering that true healing wasn't about walking again. It was about learning to walk in the right direction. What Richard didn't know yet was that Zuri had been watching him from afar during their entire encounter at the diner, her eyes shining with something that looked like pride. The man she had chosen to heal was finally beginning to understand that some miracles require much more than faith. They require the courage to face one's own darkness and the determination to turn it into light for others. 6 months after the meeting at the diner, the Washington versus Thornton Corporation case exploded in the national media. Samantha Torres had turned the evidence Richard provided into a devastating lawsuit that exposed not only criminal negligence, but a systematic pattern of corporate corruption. "Mr. Thornton," said David Harrison, entering the office without knocking, "have you completely lost your mind, handing over evidence against your own company? Do you know what that means?" Richard sat calmly behind his desk, watching the news on the television. The headlines were brutal real estate empire built on workers' deaths and leaked documents revealed decades of corruption. "It means I'm finally doing the right thing," Richard replied without taking his eyes off the screen. "The right thing?" David laughed bitterly. "You've destroyed 15 years of work. The shareholders are panicking, contracts are being cancelled, and the authorities have already issued search warrants." On television, Kesha Washington appeared on the courthouse steps, surrounded by dozens of other families who had been harmed by the Thornton Corporation. Her voice was firm and clear. "My husband died because someone decided that his life was worth less than a few thousand in savings. Today, justice has finally arrived." Richard smiled for the first time in weeks. "David, do you remember the report James Washington turned in 3 days before he died? The one you said was filed away for irrelevance?" David's face paled. "How did you? I have copies of everything. Every email you sent instructing supervisors to ignore safety violations. Every recording of you negotiating silence. Every document that proves we turned human lives into profit spreadsheets." David leaned against the wall. Reality finally hitting him. "You can't do this. I've worked for you for 15 years. I followed your orders. My orders were to maximize profits. Your actions were to choose profit over human lives. And now we both pay the price. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Thornton. There are federal agents in the lobby. They have a warrant. Richard stood up, adjusting his tie. Send them up. Patricia and David, you'll want to call your lawyer. Not the same one you paid to drop the Washington case. By the way, that recording is in the hands of the FBI, too. 2 hours later, Richard was sitting in a federal interrogation room, but not as a victim, as a voluntary witness. He had handed over to the authorities a file containing more than 2,000 pages documenting 15 years of illegal practices at his company. Mr. Thornton, said Federal Agent Sarah Chun, this evidence is extraordinary. Do you understand that by providing it, you are essentially destroying your own empire? Agent Chun, do you have children? She nodded, confused by the change of subject. Then you understand that some things are more important than money. A 10-year-old girl taught me that. The next week, the headlines changed: real estate magnate cooperates with federal investigation, and Thornton testifies against his own executives. David Harrison and 6 other executives were arrested. Fraudulent contracts were voided. Families who had been illegally evicted received millions in compensation. Richard lost 80% of his fortune in federal fines and restitution. His company was dissolved. His reputation in business circles was destroyed forever. But when Zuri found him in the park that afternoon, walking slowly among the trees, she saw something different in his eyes. It wasn't the wounded arrogance of a rich man who had lost money. It was the serenity of someone who had finally found peace. You kept your promise, she said, sitting down beside him on the same bench where it all began. What promise? To come up with the money. You gave back much more than $1 million. You gave dignity back to hundreds of families. Richard looked at his hands, the same hands that had once signed contracts that destroyed lives, now used to rebuild what had been broken. I still don't understand how you knew I could change. Zuri smiled, and for the first time she really looked like a 10-year-old, because completely bad people don't feel guilt, and you always did, even when you pretended you didn't. As the sun set over the park, Richard realized he had discovered something more valuable than any fortune. The ability to look in the mirror and recognize not the man he had been, but the man he could still become. And it all started with a girl who saw light where everyone else, including himself, saw only darkness. 2 years later, Richard Thornton walked through the halls of the Washington Community Center, a modern building erected on the same site where the dilapidated housing project where Zuri had lived once stood. The place now offered free education, medical care, and job training programs to more than 500 families. Mr. Thornton, said Kesha Washington, approaching him with a genuine smile. The graduation ceremony is about to begin. Richard nodded, adjusting his simple tie. His life was now completely different. He lived in a modest apartment, drove a used car, and worked as a volunteer consultant for NGOs fighting real estate exploitation. He no longer had millions, but for the first time in decades, he slept peacefully. In the auditorium, 23 young people prepared to receive certificates in various technical fields. Among them was Zuri, now 12, graduating in basic programming, the youngest student ever admitted to the program. Ladies and gentlemen, announced the MC, our valedictorian will be Zuri Washington. The girl walked onto the stage with the same serenity Richard remembered from that day in the park. She looked directly at him in the audience before she began. 2 years ago, I met a man who thought that power and money defined his worth. Today, that same man taught me that true wealth comes from how many lives you can touch positively. In the front row, David Harrison watched on television from the federal prison where he was serving an 8-year sentence for corruption and criminal negligence. Other executives from the former Thornton Corporation faced similar fates: reputations destroyed, fortunes confiscated, careers ruined. Some people believe in instant miracles, Zuri continued. I believe in transformations that start with a choice. To be part of the problem or part of the solution. After the ceremony, Richard found Zuri in the community center garden. She was sitting on the same kind of bench where it all began, reading a book on neuroscience. You still haven't explained how you did that, he said, sitting down beside her. And you still don't understand that the explanation doesn't matter, she replied, closing the book. What matters is what you did next. Richard looked around. Children playing on safe playgrounds, teenagers studying in well-equipped classrooms, families gaining access to opportunities that had once been the privilege of the wealthy. You know what's ironic, he said. I lost $400 million, but I've never felt richer. Zuri smiled. Because you finally learned the difference between having money and having value. That night, Richard received an unexpected phone call. It was a journalist from Forbes wanting to do a story on executives who radically changed their lives. He politely declined. His new journey didn't need the spotlight. As he hung up the phone, Richard looked out the window of his modest apartment. Across the street, the sign for the Washington Community Center glowed softly in the darkness. A 10-year-old girl had destroyed his empire to save her soul, and Richard Thornton finally understood that some miracles don't just heal the body, they heal the consciousness of those who were sick without knowing it. True transformation doesn't happen when we get back something we've lost, but when we discover something we never knew we needed. If this story of redemption and second chances touched your heart, subscribe to Black Voices for more stories that prove it's never too late to start over the right way.